Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Our discussion this afternoon is about imagining South Africa during and beyond COVID-19. So we have our esteemed colleagues here, which will be introduced shortly by our facilitator, Professor Sattler. Thanks again for making the time to be with us this afternoon for this important discussion. South Africa is, obviously South Africa is grappling like the rest of the world, to deal with devastating pandemic. We all are in this together. We deal with it, and we engage with it in various forms. So this afternoon we're going to discuss how the education sector has been doing in terms of dealing with the pandemic or responding to it in terms of the economy, the society, and also how it actually bringing the multiple divides that affect South Africa's socio-economic realities. So I'm going to hand over to our facilitator to introduce our panel this afternoon, and then we can then start our discussion. Over to you, Rico. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you, Norma, for that introduction. Today it's my privilege also to welcome everyone to this online webinar entitled Imagining South Africa During and Beyond COVID-19. Welcome especially people who have joined us, many locally, nationally, and a few from further afield. A special welcome to our three presenters today, who are all in different ways widely known for the way in which they dynamically bring synergy between their academic work and their work as activists in our society more broadly. And you'll hear a little bit more about that when they make their presentations. So I'll just make a couple of introductory remarks before I introduce the three speakers to you. And then I will also make some announcements, just some sort of admin with regard to how we'll proceed after. I want to start here with a recognition that there are diverse experiences of the pandemic in circulation, with individuals and communities across the country who are in their own different ways navigating, experiencing disruption, and seeking to overcome the impact of this pandemic. We hope to add today to the many conversations that we recognize that are taking place amongst us, in homes, between friends, between colleagues, and family members. And maybe, just maybe, today we can together begin to identify some possible fault lines and trajectories related to this overarching question, imagining South Africa during and beyond COVID-19. In my discussion with colleagues, I sort of see this title dealing with two issues. The first is how we imagine South Africa in the midst of the pandemic. And the second is what we may or what we can expect or imagine lies ahead or beyond the initial societal impact of the pandemic. So at the moment, we are all isolated, by and large, many of us, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, and we rely mostly, for the most part, on information about the world beyond our neighborhoods, on facts and figures about infection rates and mortality. This information, sets of information are really important, but they also orient our sense of safety and comfort in relation to how we feel on a day-to-day basis. And then soon, some of us, and I speak for myself here, we become fatigued and to some extent immune to the impact of the pandemic, the loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, and erosion of seeming erosion of civil liberties. We are told that through isolating, we are helping to curb the rapid spread of this virus and its impact. But this isolation also obscures the fuller picture of how the pandemic is impacting our society more broadly. We become a little sheltered and isolated. We become isolated from those who rely on carers and family members to care for them. We become isolated from those for whom home is not safe and for whom home is not a shelter or a safe place. We become a little more isolated from those who experience increasing hunger and desperation with every day. And we are being told or being asked to act responsibly for the 1.5 meters around our bodies and its contribution to the bigger picture, but it obscures that bigger picture and the impact of the pandemic. So, and I'm very confident that today these three colleagues will help us tease out some of these critical trajectories and imaginaries of what lies beyond the kind of narrow scope or the narrow scape within which we find ourselves at the moment because of the restrictions, the necessary restrictions placed upon us. I have seen and read and met with these colleagues in different ways, so I will introduce them one at a time in the order in which they will speak to us this afternoon. The first is Professor Thabo Msibi. Thabo Msibi is an associate professor in curriculum studies in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he is also the dean of and head of school. Professor Msibi is published widely in South African and international journals, and he produced and authored a book titled Hidden Sexualities of South African Teachers, Black Male Educators, and Same-Sex Desire. In 2018, he was awarded the Distinguished Alumni Early Careers Award by the Teachers College of the University of Columbia in the USA. He is also an NRF-rated scholar and carries a P rating, and is also the recipient of the inaugural Human Science Research Council Young Scholar Medal in Social Science and Humanities. Thabo, it's really lovely to have you here today, and I look forward to hearing your contribution. Our second speaker is Dr. Lubna Nadvi. Lubna Nadvi is an academic and researcher based in the School of Social Science at the University of KwaZulu-Natal also, where she lectures undergraduates and supervises postgraduate students in the disciplines of political science, international relations, and conflict management and peace studies. Her expertise are in the fields of political science, international relations, gender and feminist studies, civil society, Middle East and African politics, political Islam, and social movements. She has also published in various journals and edited volumes, and she has co-edited a book. She has contributed to popular and public publications, as well as a collection of poetry. She is a widely known community activist and freelance journalist, and comments frequently on contemporary issues in the local and international media. Dr. Nadvi has made an active contribution to various local South African struggles and campaigns, including the anti-apartheid youth student movements, HIV awareness campaigns, women's and children's rights. Lubna, thank you for being available also for making an incisive contribution today. Our third speaker is Mr. Lukhona Nguni. Lukhona holds a Bachelor of Community and Development Studies, as well as an honors degree in conflict, transformation, and peace studies, both from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Nguni also holds an MSc in African International Development from the University of Edinburgh, which he received in November 2015, after he received the Commonwealth Scholarship to pursue his studies there. He is currently a PhD researcher in the Maurice Webb Race Relations Unit and a lecturer in the School of Social Science at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Lukhona, thank you to you also. Some of you may know these, I'm sure you know these three presenters well by their work and by their activism. And I am personally quite excited to hear and engage with them on the questions of imagining South Africa during and beyond COVID-19. So before I introduce our first speaker, I'd just like to make a couple of announcements. And these are as follows, that each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. The entire webinar, as is practice at UKZN, will be recorded in its entirety. So you need to just be aware of that. There will be opportunities for Q&A after all three speakers have made their presentations, but we strongly encourage you to post your questions in the Zoom chat as we go along, so that each speaker can have an opportunity to reflect on your questions as they go along. But for those of you who wish to present questions also through simply raising your hand and making a verbal or oral question or comment briefly, just use the raising hand facility within Zoom. Okay, now it gives me the privilege to introduce our first speaker for this afternoon's webinar, Thabo Msibi. Thabo Msibi informed me that his presentation will look largely at education, particularly at the intersection with structural inequalities, the economy, and social security. He said to me he will look into what it means to live through this moment, specifically looking at issues of education and broader social issues such as gender-based violence. Also incorporating something of the imaginative, his presentation will raise or respond to some questions about what might a desirable post-COVID education system look like, and how do we move forward from here. Thabo, please, I will now hand over to you to make the first presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rico, for that wonderful warm welcome. Colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to be engaging with you today on this very important subject. Of course, as we imagine what is the current reality of COVID-19 in South Africa and what does it mean to transcend beyond this COVID moment, I want us to keep in mind that the conversation is really complicated by the fact that the reality points to a COVID existence that actually is sustained even for a number of years. And so how we navigate and negotiate our way through this moment, I think, is going to be telling. I am going to be focusing a lot on education in this talk. And in particular, I want to look at what I call structural poverty within education, and sort of the education experience within the COVID moment and also post the COVID moment. In 2003, I think many of you will recall this, the then president of the country, President Thabo Mbeki, spoke about and used the analogy of a double-story building when talking about the economic inequalities that exist in South Africa. On one hand, he cited this idea that you've got a modern economy that is on the one side of the building, and on the other, an entrapment of some sort with poor people who are caught up in a space where they cannot actually come out of, where they've got no skills, they're illiterate, and they've got no access to water, to electricity, and a range of other social needs that they need, which are not provided for them through the economy. Of course, the modern economy, for those who have access to it, enables success in the world in relation to competition and actually advancement. I wonder, as we sort of negotiate our way through engaging on what it means to be in the COVID moment and what it means to be post the COVID moment, I wonder whether, if we think about the sentiments expressed in 2003, whether these sentiments actually are not bearing any reality today, especially given the presentation by the Finance Minister, Mr. Mboweni, on the supplementary budget speech, which cited very much that South Africa is in debt, with 21 cents of every rand generated through tax being paid to repay loans. And of course, that we've got a serious youth unemployment that is nearing or over 50%, depending on which stats you look at. And of course, in the foreseeable future, this contraction of the economy. the very same sentiments that we see within the economy actually have been highlighted in the education system as actually being the reality. Nick Spall and his colleagues who do or study the economy as it relates to education have flagged that, in fact, South Africa has a bimodal education system. On the one hand, you've got 25% of schools that really mirror the apartheid design, be it in terms of private schooling and sort of the former Model C school, who actually can compete within this modern economy, but cannot, for the remainder of the 75% of the learners, they are actually entrapped in a system where they cannot compete. So in essence, I think, colleagues, what I want us to sort of firstly get from this argument that I'm making is that the reality of the COVID moment is just an emphasis of what actually was existing in South Africa prior to COVID-19. I think what has happened at this particular juncture is that the issues of inequality have been highlighted in a much more visible, much more sort of flagrant manner because COVID-19 has exposed issues that we've sort of swept under the carpet. I want to suggest that, of course, utilizing Jonathan Jansen's notion of a wounded nation, that in fact, the virus in and of itself has exposed national wounds that we've sought to sort of cover up. And in fact, these national wounds mirror a system that has been in place for centuries and decades before the COVID moment. Issues of GBV have been highly cited in the media and are gaining much more emphasis. Who would have thought that, for example, in relation to corruption, that instead of purchasing the needs for schools, the personal protective equipment, that people would see this as ventures for corrupt means and ways. So what we are seeing more and more is that the inequalities that were existing, the structural inequalities that were existing prior to the COVID moment are actually becoming more emphasized within the COVID moment. And the question is, what is going to happen post this COVID moment? I also want to sort of flag that part of the problem also rests in the spatial segregation policies that have not been changed very much post-apartheid. We have, in terms of the policy frame, we have a policy frame that is meant to allow people to own land and to purchase land, but that's only if you have means and ways. And for the significant majority of our people, they live in squalor, they live in absolute poverty, where the types of social distancing that Rico was talking about, as he correctly pointed out, are not actually, you cannot even able to begin to imagine what it might mean to socially distance within a shack where you are a couple of meters away, where you've got no access to running water, where you've got no access to electricity. So these are problems in particular, as they are social problems, but when they come into education, they actually become more emphasized, because the education space is a microcosm of the broader society. So the type of panic, the tensions, the dysfunction that we've seen in society actually plays itself out in the education space. And part of the response within education has been to see online learning, for example, as the panacea for all these challenges. So we've encouraged online learning in higher education and to some extent at basic education level. But what this has done is, again, to expose the social inequalities, which are very much structural and systemic, that exist in South Africa, where if you are middle class, if you are actually privileged, you will be able to gain access to these online forms of learning. And of course, there is another added problem to this, that even if you do have access to this online learning, we cannot, as educationists, see this online platform as a solution to the various crises that we have around education. Those of you who are in education would know that pedagogy plays a critical role, and you have to do that via contact means. There is also a discussion around sort of humane forms of education. And of course, these have been very valid in relation to issues of equality and inequality in South Africa. And I wonder, though, whether we've sufficiently reflected as to whose interests some of these projections serve. Have we actually engaged with those who are in need, who live in absolute squalor, to be able to forward these these needs to the broader population and society. And I think these are questions that we need to sort of think about: what forces are coalescing and what other forces are also in collision with this public engagements around who needs and who has and who doesn't have. Other models that have been projected have been around sort of the involvement of parents. And I want to argue here that, again, we've adopted Western thoughts around parental involvement, and Western thoughts that are highly privileging of the middle class, and sort of reject the day-to-day real experiences of the working classes. A parent who works in a factory, is uneducated, cannot be expected to be supporting a child at home through online means, because they don't even have access to education themselves. They didn't have education to themselves. A point that I do want to make also, before I move on to sort of my imagination of a post-COVID moment, is a concern around what I see as a proletarizing of teachers, making teachers more and more into workers. This notion that we can exclude teachers in the voicing of concerns around the COVID space. For example, utterances by the ministry about what teachers ought to be doing during this time have been a significant concern for somebody who is an educationist. We've heard teachers being told to go back to class regardless of whether they've got comorbidities. And this is almost like a sustained way of positioning teachers as simply workers. And that sustained manner arise from apartheid construction of education, and in particular Black teachers. And I want to sort of leave that there as an issue that concerns me greatly. So how might we sort of think about, given all of these challenges, how might we think about education differently? And here I went to sort of to the dictionary to try and understand, if we're imagining, what are we doing? What is it that we're asking people to do? And I want to suggest that I want us to rethink education altogether in this post-COVID moment. Because my argument in essence is the pre-COVID moment was not actually offering an education for the majority of the people in this country. And as we reimagine what education might be post-COVID-19, we need to sort of go with the reality that there exist structural inequalities that are so significant and so severe for the majority of our people that if we do not confront them head on, we are going to have a country in complete disarray and an education system that is going to continue to serve the interests of the minority instead of serving the interests of the majority. Here, I'm asking us that we think about our history, our desired outcomes, and our present circumstance as we map out what we may think about the post-COVID moment. Now, in engaging with this post-COVID moment and this notion of moving beyond COVID-19, I was reading a number of documents, be it from UNESCO, the World Bank, IMF, sort of key platforms or institutions that lead education debates. And it's very clear. The overwhelming majority of these documents cite the issue of inequality, particularly for the poor, as being at the forefront of sort of the damage that COVID is causing for education. So working class communities are at the forefront of the receiving end, at the brunt of the receiving end of COVID-19 and its destruction. Unless we get to a space as a country where we recognize the need to make sure that education is equitable for all, we are not going to actually deal with the issue of education and the complexities of education as they currently stand. So I would argue that there has to be a greater honest debate in the country and conversation in the country about accountability, about stability, about transparency, and what purpose education is serving in its current design. We know that for the overwhelming majority, even with COVID, even before COVID, it was not serving the purpose of actually liberating people out of the poverty line or the poverty entrapment that Mbeki spoke about in 2003. If education was not serving that purpose prior to COVID, and certainly isn't serving that purpose during COVID, we need to sort of ask ourselves deep questions about what might it mean to reconfigure education altogether. And this is at the heart of the argument that I'm making today. We of course have to keep in mind social distancing. We've got to keep sanitizing. We've got to keep all of those things that the COVID moment has presented to us. But we cannot keep all of those things in a society that does not even offer the tools within which to be able to do that. So the society that we have currently expects young people to live in squalor, to live in dilapidated environments, to go into schools that don't have water, they've got pit latrines, they don't have resources, they don't have books. The key here is that any reimagination has to center working class lives. It has to ask deep questions about what are we teaching. It has to ask what we are teaching and how we are assessing. We have to move away from the current design, which is modeled on Western ideals, modeled on assessment and an accountability regime that is supporting middle-class lifestyles. We have to be able to see the poor as the center in order for us to undo what currently is a state of affairs that is designed to keep poor people marginalized and at the verge of exclusion. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thabo, thank you very much for that very clear and strident and compelling presentation on education. The two things that struck me there was people gathered their thoughts on your presentation that was full of rich detail. The inequalities have become more acute, and that if we reimagine what is taught, how it is taught, and how it is assessed, that we hold the working class, the poor working class at the center of all of our endeavors. Thank you so much for being so very clear and putting such challenging things to us this afternoon. I'm now going to, so thank you very much, Thabo. Gives me also privilege to introduce the second speaker for this afternoon. But before I proceed with the introduction, I just want to remind our guests and participants today to please use the chat facility to pose any questions and comments that you may have pertaining to the first presentation. That will give our first presenter and other presenters the opportunities to see what your concerns are and give them an opportunity to prepare their responses. So please post them as we go along. Now back to introducing our second speaker Dr. Lubna Nadvi. Lubna today intends to focus on human rights issues that have emerged as a consequence of the lockdown. These for her include the deprivation and shortages of basic services, income and food insecurity, as well as living arrangement and structural violence, including GBV. Although these conditions were there even before COVID-19, she argues that they've been brought into sharp focus as a result of the regulations that have been put in place. Lubna will propose some of the ways in which sectors of our society could provide possible interventions to bringing about relief and hopefully some more structural and hopefully long-term change to the kind of inequalities that we've already heard about today. Lubna, thank you very much for presenting, and I look forward to hearing your contribution this afternoon. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Settler. Thank you very much to UKZN Corporate Relations for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Let me start off by just reflecting on what Professor Msibi has said in terms of setting the context for where we are in South Africa. Of course, we know that before COVID-19 came to our shores, we had all of these socio-economic inequalities there. With the regular toy-toying and the marches and protests and demonstrations that we've become used to, we're seeing all of these things unfold all of the time in terms of the deprivation, the living conditions in which people have to live, the unemployment, the poverty, the gender-based violence, and so on. So they were there, and of course they were sort of brought into sharper focus because of these regulations that were put in place, and the government expected people living in townships and informal settlements in these tiny sort of structures to socially distance and so on. And so we saw on our television screens the consequences of the enforcement of that. When the army, for example, went into the townships with the South African police services to try and force people back into their little homes and structures, it was very difficult. I mean, you can just imagine what it's like to try and coexist in a small shack structure with 5 or more people, and not be able to move around and so on. So, of course, the very real, human rights issues that we've had to sort of deal with is has become a reality. We know that in our past, in South African history, we've seen various human rights violations that have unfolded. We know about Marikana, we know about the Deni tragedy and so on. And so at the end of the day, what we have seen is a kind of series of incidences of violence that have unfolded. And so in this context where we are right now, the violence continues, sadly, and this violence is happening at multiple levels. It's the violence of the COVID-19, what it's doing to people who become infected and have to struggle with the illness, the people around them. So that's the one level of violence. But of course, the environment in which they're having to live in, if you're a poor, unemployed person living in a shack and you contract COVID-19, it's a very difficult, situation to be in. Of course, the government announced various, arrangements for isolation, to go into government facility, arrangements for testing and so on. But the issue really is that we have a socio-economic context that has already deprived, us, bulk of South Africans, for a very long time in terms of, their ability to live as, they call it a better quality of life, a better life for all. This was the sort of slogan of the ruling party for a very long time. And so the question is, what does it actually mean to live through COVID-19? Many people have spoken to this, they've shared experiences, but I really want to focus on the way forward in terms of interventions. We can, list all of the challenges, and there are so many, but I think that really for us as citizens, academics, activists, and, citizens of civil society, we need to look at ways in which we can actually intervene and act in terms of doing something substantial. So one of the things that was quite interesting in the way in which it unfolded was in the first few weeks of the lockdown, people obviously couldn't go to work. They couldn't earn an income. Many of our people have informal employment, so they couldn't actually go and work, and so they couldn't earn an income. They couldn't buy food. So what happened was that civil society, ordinary people from, sort of religious organizations, youth groups, women's groups, and so on, they just got together and they basically, started engaging in food aid and, trying to raise money to ensure that food could get to the people who couldn't access it. So this was one example of where civil society actually just, came together and spontaneously, and not that these groups were not doing food aid distribution before, but of course the need that emerged in the context of the lockdown led to people actually coming together. So what we saw was the sort of humaneness, the humanity that, sort of becomes enhanced in such situations. And what I want to speak to is the way in which we need to actually take that sense of the humanity, the care, and the sort of, sense of civic responsibility that we actually have to each other. Government put in place a range of arrangements, lockdown regulations, rules about what you could and couldn't do. But what we found was that those regulations were actually violating human rights to a significant degree. And that, for me, is something that is important to reflect on, because a lot of people spoke about, for example, this Corona Command Council, the sort of entity that was put together by the government to effectively run the country. And so there were questions around the legitimacy of that Command Council. But that's, a political debate that we political scientists sort of, engage in. But at the end of the day, our society finds itself facing a number of socioeconomic realities. How do we move forward? Where we are right now is that the country is slowly starting to open up to, lockdown measures have been eased to some degree. But of course, this COVID-19 is going to be with us for a very long time, as is hunger, as is unemployment, as is, the desperate socioeconomic situations, the living conditions. So what does that mean for us? Where does that leave us? And my argument is that we actually need to, as civil society, because to be honest, government is not really going to be able to come in and resolve this. I think that we as civil society need to bring our sort of resources together. And this is where institutions like universities, NGOs, even our local municipalities can come together and actually talk about what is it that our people are facing. The government announced a 500 billion rand plan, and of course that has faced quite a bit of criticism as well. So in terms of, we've heard the president, we've heard the minister speak about how the money will be allocated and so on. So, people are saying, okay, there is money there, but has that money actually got to the people that it needed to get to? How is it actually being dispersed? Are the people who were looking for income relief and, the UIF and so on, I mean, the very real practical bread and butter issues, have those people got the money that has been sort of set aside for them? And, many people say, well, actually, no, businesses have closed down. Restaurants and businesses that have been around for a very long time have had to shut their doors because they just have not been able to survive. So in this very real situation, circumstance that we find ourselves in, I think we have to, because we're talking about reimagining where we are and what the future is going to look like. And I think that the real reimagining has to come from civil society, of course in partnership with government. But where we are is that we actually have to fix a lot of our problems on our own. And big business also needs to come to the party. Of course, that's where the finance is. But at the end of the day, in the same way that ordinary people just got together and started giving out food aid to the people who needed it most, those of us who are in these circumstances or these spaces where we can actually come together and lend a helping hand, actually have to. So, for example, we need to talk about how we bring together the people who, are sort of in the arena of humanitarian relief and food aid and so on, and look at a long-term plan to bring about economic security. People have talked about things like putting up, food banks or sort of sustainable gardens and so on, where you can grow your own food. So food security is the one aspect that we actually really have to focus on. The other has been the issue of living circumstances. People have not been able to socially distance. People have not been able to observe all of those conditions that the government set aside. And so I'm not saying that civil society now has to go and start, building homes for all of these people, because, I mean, that is a responsibility that government still has. But I think that we need to look at ways in which we can come together with the private sector that actually is in the sort of building industry, look at ways in which we can improve living conditions. So it requires, for example, our geographers in our universities to reimagine, a sort of city and look at ways in which we can structure our living arrangements. How do we go about doing that? So there are what you would call expertise that are there. And I think that we really need to start looking at practical ways, on the ground ways, in which we can actually, address the challenges that we face. So just in conclusion, I mean, I'm saying that human rights issues have to be put at the forefront. In terms of observing or the implementation of the COVID-19 lockdown regulations, a lot of human rights have been violated. There has to be accountability for that. People have lost their lives, unfortunately. So we've got to actually ensure that as a citizenry, we're going to demand that accountability. But moving forward, what the COVID-19 pandemic has also shown us is that the way in which we have been living our lives for the last 50 years, 100 years is not sustainable. And I think Prof. Masivi also made that point. It is not, a system that allows us. It's not poor-friendly. It's not, helping the majority of people. So we have to actually reimagine our society, one that is actually going to acknowledge that the people in this country are poor, are working class, and that if we do not attend to their needs and their concerns, then we are not really dealing with, we're not really creating a sustainable context in which we can move forward. So if we empower our poor, and if we find ways in which we can actually ensure that their basic needs are taken care of, we put in place the possibility for a society where we create greater capacity. We've talked about this before, we've dreamt about it, we've even maybe come up with plans. But the point is that we have to put these in place. And this is where our municipalities come in. They need to be involved. This is where our universities come in, our NGOs, and so on and so on. So I'm appealing to all of the various sectors of society for us to put our thinking caps on and come together. And if our university can become a space, if UKZN can become a space to bring some of these people together, then I think that would be great. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share these thoughts, and I hand it over back to you, Professor Settler. Thank you so much.
Dr. Nadvi, thank you so much for your succinct presentation, and particularly for bringing into focus for us the various levels of violence that people have seen during this period, and how you very carefully unpack that kind of violence and possible ways in which both civil society, and I guess a sort of broad-based sense of civil society that includes the university, people in their communities, as well as local municipalities, for constructing possible solutions out of the situation. I particularly like how you, towards the end, draw our kind of attention to holding structures, and I guess to some extent each other accountable, right? Like the importance of accountability, because it's one thing to have visions and ambitions, but if we don't hold each other accountable to those ambitions, we struggle with some of these. Thank you so much for that. I've seen a number of questions go up already that I think you probably could respond to, like what is the role of the university within these kind of contexts. So please take an opportunity to have a look at some of the questions. Thank you for our participants today for posting questions in the Q&A. Please keep posting them, and for our panelists, feel free to sort through those as you have time. Yeah, the questions are very focused, so please keep them coming. Thank you very, very much. And Dr. Nadvi, thank you for your presentation. The last presentation is by Lukona Mnguni, and in his communication with me, he put it very short and sweet and said he will be spending some time today speaking about leadership, trust deficit, governance systems in the context of COVID-19 in South Africa. So Lukhona, I hand it over to you to unpack that very brief and succinct summary of your talk today.
Thank you, Rico, so much for chairing this panel today. And of course, one always gets the temptation to respond when they are the last one to speak and sort of say, yeah, the first speaker, second speaker. And of course, there's also the temptation to just admit into silence that, no, you have been well represented by colleagues. But, you know, before social distancing, there was another sociology theory we used to talk about. And when you Googled it, it would appear quite up on the Google results, and that's social distance. And now when you type in social distance, it's just all about social distancing that is going on. The reality is that long before there were calls for society to distance socially in terms of physical distancing, the 1.5 meter around your body that you were talking about earlier, Rico, we were already observing a troublesome phenomenon of social distance in society, where a variety of social groups were doing what we call social closure, keeping to themselves and locking away the privileges that they have, if they have privileges, and those that were underprivileged being locked and closed out of those spaces of privilege, of those spaces of resources, of those spaces of opportunities for upward mobility in life. By the time we were called upon, particularly in the South African context, being the most unequal society in the world, social distancing has long been there. What we have now added to it is the phenomenon of physical distancing, because already social groups have been getting together around some affinities that bring them about. We have not managed to cross the boundaries, and I think Prof. Msibi and Dr. Navi have done so well to map out these structural inequalities for us, be it their spatial, be it their work opportunities, be it their education, and be it the question of access to human rights. Because at times when we say there are human rights violations, we are talking about those people who already have access to their rights. There are people by virtue of their station in life who are unable to even access their human rights. They have rights on paper, in the constitution, and in theory. But in the day-to-day practice, and I usually make a very simple example, there are people who can exercise their consumer rights, for example, because they shop where they get a receipt, it has a date, and this receipt actually tells you who was serving the person, and they can make clear reference that they bought this item at this particular shop. There are people whose financial abilities don't even allow them to go to shops that give proper receipts, which then means when they bring back a effective product, it can't be assisted because really there is no great demonstration that you bought this here. The question around social distance wasn't just between social groups in society. It was also between those who govern and those who are governed. And this is where I want to zone in a bit when it comes to leadership. One of the things that we have seen with COVID-19 management is that leadership matters, because it is a leader who must pronounce measures on how to help the country mitigate the spread of COVID-19. But how society responds to the message of the leader probably depends, one, on how much trust the populace has on the leadership. If the COVID-19 found a society already suffering from a trust deficit, where leaders are not trusted in their speech, in their action, and in their promises, it then becomes very difficult for society to immediately respond to the dictates of leadership when the leaders are saying, let us embark on these forms of measures as a country. As a result of that, Rico, what we have seen, countries that have succeeded is wherein society has responded very positively and timely to what their leader have said. I know we have spoken a lot in some fora about New Zealand and how New Zealand has done well. But some people then say, look, New Zealand, small economy of about 5 million people, it's an island, perhaps it's much easier to control borders and control movement. But we are very happy when we see, New Zealand, their Super Rugby League is back. There's no social distancing at stadiums because they feel they've eliminated the virus. But at the center of that is the type of leader that they have in their Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who has inspired a positive response ever since she has taken office, who has built credibility for herself and trust in herself. But the other interesting case is Vietnam, a country of 95 million people that has successfully done well. And it's a country where there are vast areas that suffer from serious poverty and underdevelopment. But what is it that made people respond better there? The Vietnamese government, before they could worry about the plight of business, theirs was to try and attend to poor people, because there is no incentive for poor people to stay indoors and suffer from hunger when they are not being provided for, which is something that we have missed in South Africa. The promise to those who do not have an unemployment insurance, for example, unemployment insurance fund access, is that we will give them some COVID-19 relief. Even today, as we sit here, almost 100 days, if not so, since we started the lockdown, some people are yet to receive a cent from the state. Some people are yet to receive some food from the state, because when the lockdown was announced, true to form in terms of our inequality, our leadership was preoccupied by the interests of business. It was business that needed to be convinced of the lockdown, and not people who are impoverished and people who are suffering and who would immediately lose income the minute we go into the lockdown. And because of this trust deficit, because of this poor leadership, we then saw the pillaging of the very meager resources that were being given to people in the form of food parcels, being misdirected to certain areas. And that is one of the key issues in our society we are going to have to deal with, that we must accept that if we are counting our democracy dividend as a country, we have not managed to build a leadership corps that is committed to our society, that encourages human and social solidarity among our citizens, and a leadership that in actual fact commands respectability. And we saw the wheels come off just this week in terms of respectability of leadership, when the taxi industry said, no, we are going to load 100%. We don't care if government, and the government can't stop us. If they do stop us, it's going to be trouble. We'll bring the entire country to a standstill. Now, this communicates a degree of lawlessness. This communicates a degree of defiance. This communicates a government that has lost respectability because of the manner and in which it engages with society. But the taxi industry issue is also curious. It goes beyond just questioning whether leadership is leading correctly and taking stakeholders along properly. But it also communicates the public transport problem in South Africa. That for the last 26 years, we have been dependent on privately owned businesses that we call public transport, which are taxis, and we depend on them to move plus minus 65 to 73% of our daily commuters to the workplace and to places of searching for opportunities. And what is it about leadership that we need to reimagine as we move out of COVID-19? We've got to sort out the basics that are important for any society. And those basics are around questions of public transport. Can the state guarantee that it can move people safely, reliably, and affordably from their homes to their places of work or study and back to their homes? Now, this seems like a very small thing, but if you look at it in terms of how it has increased the cost of living, particularly for some middle class or entrant middle class people. The minute you start working, you've got to have a car because transport finishes at this time, you can't work late and so on. And it's not about asking for first world transportation. By the way, even in those first world countries, if you were to clearly see when those transport systems were actually built and constructed. They were part of the bedrock upon which those economies will be built upon. Because you don't have reliable public transport, and then you are going to endanger people, but also you are going to increase their cost of living, but also you are going to have a precarious situation wherein you can have this collision that is happening between government and the taxi industry at a time when all of us should be applying our minds cautiously and to the benefit of healthcare. So the point I'm trying to raise is that we haven't had a leadership that is visionary enough to implement building blocks for our economy. Because while we talk about the economy is not doing well, just today we have been told that for the third quarter running, we've been on a contraction, 2% GDP contraction on the first quarter. We've got these structural inequalities. One of the best ways to bridge spatial inequalities is to actually integrate your public transport systems. And when you talk about public transport, start thinking about townships. It must be in a way that a train that moves from Amashu is able to go to the likes of Umhlanga and then get into the CBD, other than a train that moves along the township and then docks at the very fringes of the CBD, because it is designed for poor people, but it is not designed for citizens. It is not designed with the imaginations of going beyond these structural inequalities and spatial inequalities we talk of. So the point I want to make today, Rico, is that we've got to focus on the type of leadership that we elect into office in our society. Leadership is not about good speeches, not about nice ties and suits. Leadership is in action. It's in actually what you do. I cringe all the time when I hear South African government ministers and even the president at times warning us that in 2 weeks' time, things are still going to get very bad with COVID-19. Instead of trying to convince us that they are in actual fact leading and are getting ahead of the problem, because the countries that have led their societies, their philosophical undertaking was not to prepare their health system to cope with the scourge of COVID-19. It was to eliminate COVID-19. They acted early, they acted timely, and of course, as I propose, they enjoyed some level of trust with their citizens, and that is something that we are going to need to grapple with. And lastly, Lubna talks about municipalities as part of the solution, local government closest to people. I think the very system of government is being put to question. A lot is too centralized in terms of resources, in terms of decision making, and that means filtering to society takes some time for those to impact people. And I think that question some of us keep raising, whether we need provinces in South Africa, is back to the fore, because the closer and more devolved your government is, the more decision making and resources are to people, the better you will be able to withstand crisis. Because in some instances, some of us tried to intervene with municipalities and said, extend this kind of social relief to informal traders, extend this kind of social relief to people who do not have food. All people were pointing us, go to province, social development. That's where you are going to get help. That is too distant from people, and it exacerbates this social distance and inequality in society, because people where they are and closest to where they are disempowered. When they have a voice, institutions that they talk to and are closest to them are disempowered and have no resources. And we've got to look at how do we devolve those governance functions so that we get them much closer to people, and we will be able to respond even better in future when we are faced with this type of crisis. Thank you, Rico.
Lukhona, thank you very much for your presentation there, sort of bringing some of and incorporating some of the issues that have been raised by some of our participants, as well as issues picked up by Thabo Msibi and Lubna Nadvi. Thank you particularly for how you hold in tension the issue of lack of trust with kind of and credibility in the state, but also actually suggesting that there are new models of leadership at multiple spheres of government, or all spheres of government, as you pointed out at the end, that there may be some problems with the very form within which these efforts for social reform is organized under the current administration. So thank you very much for drawing our attention to that. I thank all three speakers for really dynamic presentations, different and yet so inter and closely related and speaking to each other. Also want to thank the participants who have in different places, both in the Q&A, I've responded to some participants and have signaled for our various presenters to respond to specific things. But I'd like to also ask, because there's been in the chat some other questions, so I'm going to raise a few more just specifically. So I know, Thabo, you may have picked up some already, so I'm going to give two to you that I've picked from the chat and the Q&A. There was a question from Edmore Ntili, and the question is, how do we defend quality education? A second question from Susan Ausmeyer, I hope I pronounced that also correctly. The question was, how do we go about enforcing or implementing the changes that you proposed? And a third question that I think is more or less relevant and was directed to you from Jerusa Joseph was, how open do you think the South African government is to re-looking at the education system with a focus on the poor? So that's to you, Thabo. Lubna, there's a question. I apologize that I didn't pick up the person's name here, but the question was, what is the place of the university for implementing social change? And a second question by Nellie Sharpley, what themes should we put in place to getting people to buy into the social contract? Right, some of the things you talked about, civil society, and you may cluster these together, of course. And lastly, how do we sustain efforts initiated in local communities? This was by Kansna Chetty, who spoke about efforts that were successful in local communities, but their concern was, how do we sustain it post this moment? How do we build on that energy? Lukhona, I know you've just finished speaking, so I will just give you one short one. And this was a question related to how can UKZN, and I know you spoke of government, but I think there's a question here around leadership and trust and credibility. The one was, how can UKZN management, what can they do to close the gap between online learning and people with precarious incomes? And the second question by Zama Sabir is, how do we ensure we have a blueprint that actually breaks the bondage of poverty and inequality? I know that's a lot of questions, but I'm sure you've sort of caught on to some of it. For our participants, please keep posting questions. Our presenters keep reading, and I keep reading as well, together with Norma Zondo. Thabo, over to you first, and then when you're done, please hand over to Lubna, and then Lubna, if you hand over to Lukhona, just so we stop with me interspersing. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Professor Settler, and thank you to everybody for the questions asked, which are indeed quite complex. And really require deep thinking around. So let me maybe start with the whole question of defending quality education in South Africa. And I think I want to sort of throw the question back and ask, do we have quality education in South Africa? And this is the fundamental argument that I'm making in this presentation, that if you're going to be speaking about quality education or even educational access, just generally, has always been generally around meeting numbers as envisioned by UNESCO, the World Bank, and so forth, in relation to who goes into the formal schooling sector. But fundamentally, there is a problem with the sector in and of itself. If you are from a middle-class community, and there's a question that was asked, who is the poor? Are we just defining poor in relation to economy? No, actually, we know that of the intersection of race and economy. And of course, the image of the poor in South Africa as it stands is black. So we need to sort of be conscious of that. So what fundamentally the issue for me is that if we are going to be projecting the notion of defending quality education, we need to bear in mind that quality education exists only for 25% or so of the South African learners in schools and in higher education. It doesn't exist for the majority of people. So what we need to start thinking about, and sort of colleagues Lubna and Lukona have started speaking about this, where we have multi-sectoral partnerships, and that was the other question that colleagues were asking, well, what model exists? We know of models that exist where the community itself has said, listen, this is our school. We want to invest in our school. We want to make sure that our school thrives. The fact that during COVID-19, a significant portion of our schools across the country have been torched, damaged, and so forth is reflective of the deep problems that we have in society, that even the schools themselves are not perceived by the communities as spaces or areas where they can sort of be proud of, or where they have a personal investment on. But of course, we are aware that there are other political issues that are assigned or aligned with the torching of schools and the destruction that we've seen. But fundamentally, I am of the view that communities don't necessarily see schools as serving the purpose of transforming their lives, transforming the society, and actually improving life as it stands. In fact, it is quite opposite. So in terms of defending quality education, we need to sort of, and I am strongly of the view of a complete overhaul. And I've noticed that there are multiple comments, people suggesting that it is almost impossible to overhaul education. Yes, it is a bit, it is challenging. So I will not sort of suggest that it's something that is trivial, that we can do overnight. And we understand that historically, the government had to deal with multiple departments of education, something that Lukona was alluding to in relation to the provincial configurations, for example. The fact that all of these departments had to be convened under one and actually play themselves out in the same ways and patterns as they did during apartheid is saying something about the need to look at what is currently in place. We cannot have an education system that is there serving the interests of the minority when the majority actually are living in squalor, and where they are prepared by the very system itself to remain in poverty and not to move out of poverty. So, you know, we've given access to some extent, but are our people getting quality? That's an altogether different question. I think I'll end there and give colleagues an opportunity to move on.
Thank you. I had a question that looked at what is the place of the university for implementing change. I think that this is a multi-layered question, because the role of the university is primarily teaching and learning, in that we have students who come, and of course research. We have students who come to university to get an education, and they basically register for courses, they take on degrees, and you know, they engage in the process of teaching and learning. And of course, as academics, we engage in research, we create new knowledge, we engage with existing knowledge. So that is the kind of core business of the university, if you want to call it that. But the university is part of a bigger, society. It is part of a larger community. The people who live in the townships are the students who come to university. Their parents who are working as maybe domestics in people's homes are part of that society. There are, sort of so many people who are part of that bigger community. So the university is really a component of larger society and larger civil society, and therefore it has to acknowledge the realities of, the socio-economic challenges that we have. One of the challenges, and Prof. Msibi has, addressed it to some degree, has been this issue of the sort of teaching, online teaching that we're, sort of doing at the moment. And some people have said, well, should we actually be doing online teaching? Because there are many students who are being left out of this process. They don't have access to data, they don't have access to the means to be able to participate. So, I mean, that's an ongoing debate and so on. But what I want to say is that the role of the university is actually to bring people together, to bring minds and resources and ideas together that are going to, be allowed to flourish. University is not a place where we should be censoring ideas or clamping down on ideas, nor is it a place where, we should sort of be saying, okay, you can't do this or you can't do that. Basically, a university brings people from the society together. And I really think, we're of course talking to each other now on online spaces, and ideally it would be wonderful for us to all sit together in a room facing each other face to face, but COVID-19 doesn't allow that at the moment. But what I think we should actually do, and I'd like to propose this, is that UKZN as a powerful institution in the region looks at ways in which, and possibly academic departments, schools can do this on their own, but as an institution, that we look at the sort of key problems that face us immediately. What are the social challenges that we are having to deal with right now, and look at the expertise, the existing resources and expertise that we have within the university community that can actually come together and try and resolve it. So let's look at what we actually have in terms, we have amazing academic minds, we have amazing research that's being done to try and resolve social issues, and not just for now until, we have COVID-19, and once it's over, then, we don't have to do it anymore. This is the opportunity, this is the time that we bring these minds together now so that we can imagine the future for another 50 years, 100 years, so that we put in place a basic structure for a society that is going to be sustainable. So I think that's really what the role of the university is. It's multi-layered, but in order to fix the problems that we have, I think we need to bring these resources together. So I'm proposing that is something that we can do, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Lubna. I think Rico, I'll just include a question here from Lungisani Dladla, who talks about how the online life has taken over, and at ways we couldn't have imagined at the end of 2019, and that is quite true. And he asks, do I think this is probably the era where residential or contact universities might begin to slide into obscurity? I think, when we're talking about reimagining South Africa post-COVID-19, we must not be stuck in the practices that we are undertaking to mitigate the crisis or to cope with the crisis. Much of what we are doing now are measures on how best for us to cope with the crisis. It is not about how our society is going to look like post-COVID. What we should be doing post-COVID is to ask, what are the things that we did that frustrated us from building the type of society that will be able to withstand a crisis like COVID? What are the ingredients that help any society, particularly those that have done well, to stand out in terms of how they have managed COVID-19? That is a level of solidarity among people. That is the issue of leadership in terms of visions and making sure that leaders are building more equal societies that have opportunities in real terms, particularly for those who were previously disadvantaged. The other thing that is very important is the ease at which we can get resources to people. And so contact learning will come back. By the way, after this whole COVID-19 has gone away and we have managed to either eliminate it eventually or there's a vaccine and we can cope with it, the reality is that human beings have faced crisis time immemorial. And throughout the ages, society has tended to retreat and revert back to its old ways because those are known and comfortable. But what we have seen, particularly in the last 100 years, since the Spanish flu, since the crash of Wall Street, since World War II, since the recent financial crisis of 2008, we have now seen that it is not wise for us to leave things as they are and carry on and go back to life as normal. Because the more we are faced with crisis, the greater the devastation of that crisis, because we are allowing inequalities to exacerbate in a way that is unsustainable for the sustenance of human security, for the sustenance of the environment, and generally ecological integrity. And this is where somebody, I think Ed Mondini says, you know, leaders are under pressure, so we must not be too hard on them, because there are these global economic hegemonic systems, which, you know, as academics, we might be closing our minds to by continuously blaming those closest to us, because global exploitation systems still sustain. Yes, they do still sustain, but with the little sovereignty that we have, nobody says someone must inflate the money it costs to construct a bed. Nobody says somebody must steal the money earmarked for food parcels. And I think the minute we excuse those blind spots by using imperialistic notions of debate, which we do know that they are there, the questions of dependency, the questions of resources exploitation. But if we use those theoretical framings to even mask the smallest things that are within our reach, we are not going to transform society, because we are going to use a scarecrow of imperialism to justify thievery at the local level. And that, for me, cannot be done. These things are not mutually exclusive. You can fight global hegemonic systems whilst you still fight at the local level for competent leadership that can in actual fact be courageous enough to withstand the pressures that are put to them by these global economic hegemonic systems. And Rico, the question you had put to me, which is about UKZN, but I think it's not just about UKZN. The problem is not just about UKZN in terms of closing the gap between online learning and individuals with precarious incomes. The problem is universal throughout the country because of these problems that we have already highlighted and the systemic inequalities that are there. Personally, and I'm on record on this, I proposed that we do not do online learning because there is nobody who can overcome the deficit that those learners or students who come from homes, whether it's because they don't have the resources, whether it's because they don't have the connectivity, whether it's because of the precarious incomes and they've got to supplement income activity for livelihood, or in some instances, a way of mental illness that all of us at some point succumb to some minor depression, some anxiety because of the nature of the crisis we are facing. People who have to bury their loved ones, how are they coping? How is society coping at a time where there is grief that overwhelms human beings? How are we meant to be productive in that space? I had said, let's find other ways for people to be productive. Let's find other ways for people to be stimulated, because what is important is that our minds are stimulated. The rush to complete the 2020 academic year at all costs is actually going to cost us much more in the long term. And we will be the ones, the very people who have taken the decisions to try and complete the academic year of 2020 will be the ones writing papers as to how wrong, what are the problems that have been given into the education system by the year 2020 actions of trying to complete the academic year. But of course, hindsight is always the best teacher for many people. Rama's question is very difficult, Rico, in terms of a blueprint on breaking the bondage of poverty and inequality. But I think it starts with imagining the right institutions, the right people who should be in those institutions. Like I said, let us reimagine our governance system. I don't think the current governance system helps us by any measure to deal with some of our social problems. Lubna has spoken about civil society. Abo has talked about a liberating pedagogy in education. But we do know there are people who block this attempt to try and revolutionize these spaces. And I think for me, what is important post-COVID is that like-minded people must not lose the momentum that they have gained during this period to try and build these bonds of solidarity. Like-minded people must maintain the momentum that they've gained during COVID-19, and we must carry on to push for these changes if we are to see a society without the inequalities and the poverty that we are alluding to today.
Lukhona, thank you very much. Thank you very much for all three colleagues for your responses to some of the questions. I'm aware that there are umpteen other really urgent and pertinent questions, but I'm sure if I open up to too many more questions, our chair, Norma Zondo, will remind me that we probably got another sort of 7 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask all three panelists to maybe respond to a question that they think is something pertinent that they'd like to respond to from one of our participants here today. And I would like to, as part of sort of closing up, also just ask you, since this was raised by a number of you, that all three of you spoke to a focus on the poor as absolutely necessary as a way forward. The need to build a broad-based solidarity. And then I have questions about whether you think there is an appetite or an opportunity for change that we can sustain beyond this moment. So that's a sort of question around, can we imagine that possibility? I know some people have asked questions in between. And then there was a question here, which I think I cannot overlook because it is a challenging question to all of us with ramifications for the society, and it comes from one of our colleagues, Sarah Reddy. She asked, how do we design a curriculum of care where human dignity and respect for human life is foregrounded, right? So we can have these ambitions, but how do we design a curriculum and make the university part of developing a curriculum of care that can have the kinds of impact that all three of you have alerted us and challenged us to think about today? I'm going to start with you, Lukhona, very briefly, and then move backwards. Yeah.
Thank you, Rico. We definitely do not want to take people's afternoon entirely. I think, look, for me, the momentum is there, the appetite is there, and I think to an extent the moment is opportune, because it does take crisis for people to realize just how much they need change and how seriously some of the issues some people have been highlighting over the years are, and how they impact on their day-to-day lives. And I'm sure now a number of people are more circumspect in how they think about questions of leadership, how they think about our society, and how they think about their own place in society. And therefore, I do think there is a window of opportunity. And of course, in terms of imagining and reimagining some of these things, we were presented during the lockdown. And I'm sure, Lubna, from a political science point of view, with what we may call MANA, with the Constitutional Court judgment on the Electoral Act, because it says, let us reimagine our electoral system, questions of accountability, issues of governance. Cyrus's question is very difficult, but at the same time, I think easy. We need to pluck ourselves out from what is orthodox, but we need leaders who are going to back that up. And I'm glad Thabo is here, is the dean in the School of Education. We need those type of leaders who are strategically placed, who are going to back lecturers, who are willing to pluck themselves out of what is orthodox. One of the issues that is quite clear, particularly to us at the university level, and I will not speak as a teacher because I have not been in a school, we do not appreciate what we call prior knowledge before the student enters the gates of the university. What is it that they know? What is it that they expect to be engaged on? And what is it that they bring? We treat them as empty shells that we just need to put things inside. And I think that is one way in which we can foreground a pedagogy that cares, foreground a pedagogy that centers humanity. Thank you, Rico.
Lubna, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I've been trying to answer some of the questions that have come up. I want to speak to two things. One is that, as a response to the COVID-19, there has been what is called the People's Coalition that has been set up, COVID-19 People's Coalition, and it's a sort of grouping of civil society organizations that have come together, and there's different working groups. So the people who are interested in actually being involved on the ground. If you just sort of Google People's Coalition, you'll find them online and all of the different working groups. So they have WhatsApp groups and so on. So that's one practical way in which you can connect to people who are dealing with, for example, food insecurity, education, gender-based violence, and so on. I'm also part of some of these groups, so I can speak to, they're actually doing practical on-the-ground work regarding, reaching out to people. The other thing I want to speak to is about this question that was raised about a pedagogy of care or a curriculum of care. There's a group of academics nationally that have been having a conversation about how to, and as Economies said, let's break out of this box or this mold or this orthodoxy. There's a group of academics that have been talking about social pedagogy, which is saying that, we, given the realities that we face right now, that maybe we need to stop the online teaching and learning or rather phase it in, because at the moment, people live in circumstances where they have to attend to other realities. They don't have an environment in which they can actually study as sort of comfortably as perhaps someone who has access to a computer and a lounge and so on. So the social pedagogy model, I think it's been created, it's been circulated, and I think that we should put it on our UKZN website, or we should make it available to the public at large, because a lot of the colleagues and people here have raised questions about what is a model. And so a model has been created, which says how do we respond regarding teaching and learning in a time of pandemic. It's there. And so I just want to say, reach out to us and we'll make that document available to you and perhaps put it online on our website. So those are the few things I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Thabo, over to you for the last one.
Very briefly, Thabo, we've actually run out of time,
Okay.
very, very briefly.
I'll be 20 seconds. Okay, so colleagues, for me, the fundamental issue here is that our education system as it stands today assumes an apolitical structure. It assumes that identity of people does not matter and that we're there in a space to deliver the curriculum, the content, and then it ends there. If we are going to be delivering a pedagogy of care, we must understand that we are there to teach individuals who have identities and who carry those identities with them into the learning space. And that so too, as teachers, we carry our own identities into those spaces. So how we navigate those spaces is critical for our own identity formation and our own reconfiguration of the identity as we move forward, because what our students bring into the classroom shapes who we are, and we also shape what the students have. So as we think about what a caring post-COVID education would look like, it's something that we've been saying for some time. It is critical that we center identity in the various conversations that we have. Finally, I think I want to just say very quickly that if we're going to bring about change, I want to say that change in any education space is really, really hard. Ask Mayosi, whose report has just been released recently. Ask the various vice chancellors who have been torched, kicked out of office. Ask the various academics who've sought to transform a system, who have been pushed out literally out of the system because of the various ideas they hold. So to understand that we are dealing with a structure and to acknowledge that it may be very difficult to unravel that structure that has been sustained through centuries, but it's something that must be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Thabo. Thank you to everyone. I hand over to Norma. Thank you to all our participants and for your wonderful questions.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to all the participants that joined us this afternoon for your engagement. You were actively engaged in these various discussions that we had this afternoon. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for the robust and insightful discussions. I'm sure we all learned something, or we've got something to take home this afternoon. And to our, I will call you facilitator, fantastic. Thank you so much, Rico. You did an amazing job this afternoon, and we really appreciate your presence, and also for actually making sure that we get all the questions covered, and our panelists give their best. You actually managed to get the best out of everybody this afternoon. Prof. Settler is actually a sociologist of religion at UKZN. And he is specialized in areas of race, migration, and post-colonity. So he was actually very rightfully so for this discussion this afternoon. Thanks again for bearing with us. I think we did go over time, so I think people are still here. So thank you very much for making sure that you engage, and also make sure that you do join us again for our next discussion, which will be on mental health. There is also another one on racism that is taking place tomorrow. Do join us and make sure that you watch this place, because we are engaging on various topics on the area of COVID-19, because it affects a whole lot of aspects of our lives. So let's keep engaging, let's keep discussing, and take this discussion forward. Unfortunately, Zakiel Mkize, we've run out of time, so we won't be able to take your question from the floor. Hopefully you manage to send your question through, but you can also engage directly with our panelists via emails, and they will definitely respond to any questions that were not answered today. Let's keep the conversation going. Keep distancing. I know now we've learned about closure. So we're physical distancing. We're distancing from the corner. So there's a whole lot of things that we actually had to learn to do that we didn't know about these things before. So as hard as it is to social distancing, so we have to do it. This physical distancing. I know now there's a discussion. There's somebody who asked a question about where he actually has written a manuscript on social distancing, and is asking where he can publish that. So maybe if any of you knows, then maybe do assist. I can't recall the name, but do assist with that as well. But please send us any emails if you have any other questions so that we can answer. Thanks again for your time. Do have a lovely afternoon. Please join us again next time. Thank you, Lucorna, Lubna, Tabo, Rico, all the best. Thank you so much. Bye, colleagues.